Okay, Assalamualaikum. Our next topic adalah cluster sampling technique. Okay, the cluster sample is obtained by dividing the population into section or cluster and then selecting one or more cluster and using all the members in the cluster as the members of the sample. Okay, if our sample can be divided into subgroups, so before this, we know that we can use the stratified sampling technique if our population can be divided into groups yang dinamakan strata. So sama juga untuk cluster, if our population can be divided into subgroups, we can also use the cluster sampling technique. But syarat dia, sebelum ni strata you punya subgroup, dia punya within the strata should be homogeneous and between the strata are heterogeneous. Okay. Berbeza dengan cluster, cluster ni group juga, subgroup juga, dinamakan cluster because of within the cluster are heterogeneous but between the cluster are homogeneous. Dia berbeza. And usually we will use cluster sampling if the population are large. Okay, our population is large, so the researcher tend to use the cluster sampling technique. Okay, so macam mana dia punya process of cluster sampling technique? Okay, kata kat sini, selecting one or more cluster and using all the members in the cluster as the members of the sample. Okay, before this, dalam stratified sampling technique, we have, let's say we have 5 subgroups ataupun we have 5 strata. Okay, the way we select the sample adalah we need to select the sample from each subgroup. Betul. Kita kena select sample from each subgroup kalau strata sampling technique. Okay, for cluster, let's say we have 5 cluster, which is the cluster we have specified within the cluster ataupun within the subgroup adalah heterogeneous and between the subgroup adalah homogeneous. Sebab tu kita panggil cluster. Okay, we have 5 cluster contohnya. We only select 2 cluster sahaja. And then all the members dalam 2 selected cluster tadi will be choose as sample. Okay, kalau strata, kita ada 5 strata, kita akan pilih sampel daripada setiap strata. Tapi untuk cluster, kita ada 5 cluster, kita hanya pilih 2 cluster sahaja, tetapi kita akan ambil, we take all the sample from these 2 cluster. Semua sekali. Kita ambil semua sekali daripada 2 selected cluster. Kalau stratified, kita ambil sikit-sikit from each strata, kita ambil sikit-sikit dia punya sampel. Tapi untuk cluster, walaupun ada 5, tapi kita ambil 2 cluster sahaja and we take all the members in the selected cluster tadi sebagai sampel. Itu beza dia. So the process is, first we need to determine the cluster first. Okay, according to your study lah. Depends pada your study. Okay, kita divided the cluster, the population into cluster and then we select randomly sample cluster. Kita select sample cluster sahaja. Kita select cluster. Okay, kita select cluster, several cluster and then measure all the subjects within the sample cluster. Okay, ini illustrationnya. Contohnya kat sini, we have 6 cluster. Dalam cluster ni, heterogeneous, berbeza. Dalam cluster ni, berbeza. Okay, tapi between the cluster, homogeneous. Okay, dia ada merah juga kat sini. Kat sini pun ada merah. Kat sini ada merah, kat sini ada biru, kat sini ada biru, kat sini hijau, kat sini hijau, kat sini hijau. Okay, so between the cluster is within the cluster is hetero, between the cluster is homogeneous. And from this 6 cluster, we only select 2 cluster, and all the members in these 2 cluster will be the sample. Okay, sebelum ni kita select sample. Kalau strata, kalau cluster kita select cluster. And semua subjek dalam cluster selected will be the sample. Itu bezanya. Okay, we look at the example. Suppose a researcher wishes to survey apartment dwellers in a large city. If there are 10 apartment buildings in the city, the researcher can select at random 2 buildings from the 10 and interview all the residents of this building. Okay, so kat sini dia nak survey about the apartment in a large city. So biasanya kita akan gunakan cluster sampling technique ni. Researcher akan gunakan this cluster sampling technique if the population involve the large area. Let's say kalau UiTM Kelantan tu kita consider small area saja sebab UiTM Kelantan sahaja. Okay, kalau in a large city dalam Kelantan contohnya, itu adalah contoh large population. So kita tak boleh nak cater all setiap tempat. So because of that, we can use the cluster sampling technique. Okay, so berbalik kepada this example. If there are 10 apartment building in the city, so in the city ada 10 apartment. Dalam apartment tu ada banyak level pula kan. So it cover large population. The researcher can select at random only 2 building. Dia pilih 2 sahaja daripada 10 apartment. So the researcher akan fokus kepada 2 building sahaja. Okay. And then interview all the resident of these 2 buildings. So dia akan fokus kepada 2 building dan semua resident dalam these 2 building will be the samples. Okay. Contoh lain, if one wanted to do a study involving the patients in the hospital in New York City, okay, the large population, it would be very costly and time consuming to try to obtain a random sample of patients since they would spread over a large area. Okay. Instead, a few hospitals could be selected at random and the patients in these hospitals would be interviewed in a cluster. So, kita boleh suggestkan the hospital will be the cluster and we just select a few hospitals saja ataupun a few clusters saja sebagai sample cluster and all the patients in the selected hospital will be interviewed. Okay. Okay, ini adalah beza contoh. Kita tengok illustration, beza antara stratified dan cluster sampling. Kalau stratified, we have 6 strata and then we select. Kalau tengok sini, for every strata, dia homogeneous. Sini semua black color. Sini semua blue color. Sini semua purple. Okay. So, within the strata is homogeneous. Between the strata is heterogeneous. So, from here, from the 6 strata, we need to select the sample from each of these strata. Okay, kat sini kita select 2 member, 3 member and so on. So from each of the strata, there will be the representative from each strata. Okay, how about the cluster? So from here kalau tengok kita ada 6 cluster and each from within the cluster, each of the members in each cluster will be hetero. Dia berbeza. Tengok color yang berbeza. Okay, so dia punya karakteristik tu adalah berbeza di antara first sample dengan the second sample and so on. Okay, so from this 6 cluster, we only select 2 cluster saja. Kita pilih cluster. We select 2 sample and then all the members in the selected cluster will be the samples. Okay, ini beza antara stratified dan cluster. So usually if our population is small, we can use stratified. And if our population is large, dia punya geographical area to large, dan susah nak dapatkan respondent. So we will use cluster sampling technique. Okay, so macam mana nak pilih daripada 6 ni, nak pilih 2 sahaja cluster. We can use either SRS technique ataupun systematic sampling technique. Okay, sama macam sebelum lah. Cara randomly, whether using the systematic ataupun using the SRS technique. You know how the process, how to select the sample using these two techniques. Okay. Okay. Alright. Ini adalah illustration from your, kalau you tengok your manual. Okay, this is the illustration for cluster. From 5, we only select 3 and all the members in the selected cluster will be the sample. Okay. Alright. And then advantages, as usual, you need to memorize 1 or 2 of the advantages for each of these sampling technique. Okay, for cluster, dia punya advantages adalah economically more efficient than the SRS, easy to do without a population list, lowest cost per sample, especially with geographic cluster. Okay, lower cost if the population is large, sebab kita hanya select, kita akan hanya fokus kepada certain geographic area sahaja. Okay, so it will lower the cost. Easy to do without a population list. If we cannot have the sampling frame, so we can use the cluster sampling because of kita pilih clustered sample, kan? Kita hanya pilih cluster sahaja. And then all the members dalam tu will be the sample. So tak perlu ada population list. Okay, dia punya disadvantages as difficult to compute and interpret the result. Because of nak conduct cluster sampling technique, you need to carefully determine the cluster itself. Kena betul-betul determine dia punya cluster. Apa cluster, tempat ke, residence ke, and so on. Sebab kena pastikan betul-betul within the cluster adalah hetero and between the cluster adalah homogeneous. So it depends pada your study. Okay. Here, look at the example of cluster sampling. A large firm is considering to implement a new salary scheme and wishes to determine the proportion of employees that agree with the new policy. The firm has 20 branches located throughout the Malaysia. So this is the large population. A sample of 5 branches was selected, and the opinion of all the employees regarding the new scheme were obtained. Okay, dia kata kat sini, dia punya keyword kat sini, a sample of 5 branches. So branches ni adalah cluster, and sample of 5 cluster is selected. So the best sampling technique used for this case study adalah cluster sampling technique. Okay, we go one by one of the question. Ini sebagai revision untuk you all lah. Untuk soalan A, B dan juga C ni. Describe the population and sample for the study. What is the population here? Populationnya adalah the employees, right? All the employees in 20 branches throughout the Malaysia. The sample pula adalah the employees from 5 branches. Okay. B, explain the sampling frame for the study. So the sampling frame will be the list of employees from 5 branches. Identify the type of variable. Okay, what is the characteristic of interest here? Dia nak kaji pasal apa? Okay, here dia kata nak study about the proportion of the employees that agree with the new policy. So the type of variable adalah proportion of the employees that agree with the new policy, and the scale of measurement is ratio. Betul tak? Okay. Describe the sampling technique used in this study. It is the cluster sampling technique. If systematic sampling technique was employed to select 5 branches from 20, explain how it will be conducted. Okay, as I mentioned tadi, we can select the clustered sample using SRS ataupun systematic. Okay. So let's say kat sini dia nak gunakan systematic, which is nak select 5 daripada 20 branches tadi, gunakan systematic sampling technique. So recall macam mana dia punya process of systematic sampling. First of all, you need to listkan dia punya sampling frame. So list kat sini, nak listkan sampling frame kat sini adalah listkan the cluster lah, sebab you nak pilih the sample kat sini adalah nak want to select the clustered sample. So list down the 20 branches of the firm. Okay, list down all the 20 branches and apa ni, sortkan. Okay, then rename ataupun numberkan 1 until the 20th branch. Okay, and then next find the interval k, which is 20 divided by 5. You will get 4. Okay, and then the first sample will be the fourth cluster yang keempat. Ataupun boleh juga you nak pilih daripada nombor 1 hingga 4, you boleh pilih any random number. Okay, let's say saya pilih kat sini random number 1 until 4, I pilih number 4. So the fourth branches will be the first clustered sample. The second clustered sample will be the 8th branch. Okay, branch yang keempat, branch yang ke-8, branch yang ke-12. Okay, select from the list yang you dah sort tadi, list of the branches yang you dah sort tadi. Okay, last sekali, sehinggalah do that until you get the 5 branches. You can explain in your own words, asalkan as long as the key point tu sampai. Okay. Alright, F ni belum boleh jawab lagi. Okay, that is the way how you explain about the cluster sampling technique.